Hello, everyone, and welcome to MAP Forum. I'm Nagar Rokhar, and I have the pleasure of hosting the weekly webinars for the Medici Archive project. Today, I'm delighted to welcome Professor Ali Akhtar, who is a full professor of global history and Islamic arts at the Akhawayn University in Morocco. And I believe this is probably the first time we're having a guest from Morocco. Thank you so much, Professor Akhtar, for joining us today and accepting our invitation.
Thank you for having me.
Of course, we're looking forward to hearing all about your most recent book, and the screen is all yours now.
Great. So I'll go ahead and share my screen here, and let me share the screen, and then let's take a desktop. Great. This one and slideshow. Oops. Present. Great. So you can see everything here?
Yes, beautiful. Thank you.
Great. Well, thank you for having me. My name is Dr. Ali Akhtar. I'm a professor at AUI, Akhawayn University in Ifrane, which is in Morocco. I did my PhD at NYU and undergrad at Cornell. And my talk today is titled Why Renaissance Artists Built a Global Aesthetic, Bronzino, Pollaiuolo, Bellini in Florence and Venice. And you'll see here that there are these paintings that I've included in the opening slide, but one of them does not come from Renaissance Italy. On the far left, that's a painting by Vermeer, part of a pair of paintings called The Astronomer and the Geographer. And part of the reason I've included that painting is because the Renaissance in Italy, of course, corresponds or occurs at a time that overlaps with the Age of Exploration. And that's really what I wanted to start with. Italy during the Renaissance was a center of innovation that really came partly out of its global exchange with regions across like the Middle East and North Africa, including the Ottoman Empire, the Safavid Empire in Iran, Morocco. And I'm really interested in how Italian innovation draws on or is partly rooted in all of this global exchange and some of its outcomes, in particular, innovation in the fashion industry, design, and also innovation in aesthetics, in the paintings of the time, the frescoes, that really begin to use new techniques to capture all of this change. And so let's take a look at, let's start with, so a bit about my books. This is coming out of my latest book on the right, Italy and the Islamic World from Caesar to Mussolini. My second book in the middle was titled 1368, China and the Making of the Modern World, published by Stanford. And my first book was titled Philosophers, Sufis and Caliphs. And across my work, I'm very interested in how human innovation across history in the ancient, medieval, modern world is often driven by a lot of cross-cultural exchange and cross-cultural innovation and cross-cultural exchange. And so that can be innovation in science, technology, medicine, but also art and aesthetics, and in this case, fashion. And we'll be looking a bit at Florence, innovations in Venice, and also in Rome and the Roman Catholic Church. And so we'll start with this painting by the Pollaiuolo brothers, which captures a beautiful representation of a Florentine lady who is part of a trend in Florentine and Tuscan art in the 15 and 1600s that begins to represent less sacred images and more everyday scenes and forms. And in this case, we're seeing a young lady in Florence who is wearing a traditional tunic or a shirt, long shirt, dress, but it has this very interesting dimension to it on the side, the sleeves. You can see the color pops out and it's in red, and it's actually made of silk. So why were the Tuscan and Florentine clothing designers beginning to experiment with new types of designs, including these sleeves that in this case are actually removable? Well, what we see here is that the silk industry at the time, the Italians in Florence and also in Venice and Rome one of the things that they were experimenting with was expanding their silk trade, their very profitable silk trade, with empires like the Ottoman Empire and the Safavid Empire in Iran. The Italians were always in this very interesting position to be able to import a lot of high-priced commodities at a low cost and sell them at a high cost around Europe, from places like Japan, China, India, and a lot of those imports came through the Middle East and North Africa. And of course, part of the motivation for the Age of Exploration on the part of the Spanish and the Portuguese and the Dutch was to find a way to bypass a lot of Middle Eastern, North African manufacturers and to be able to get to wholesale price markets in China and Indonesia for things like spices, porcelain, and especially silk. And so what the Italians were doing here was, rather than participate in the Age of Exploration, which they do at a kind of individual level. You have individual sailors like Christopher Columbus, other mariners like Pigafetta. At a more republic level, Italy was made up of republics and duchies and kingdoms at the time. They really doubled down on their imports from the Middle East and North Africa because they had centuries of close trade with these regions. And they also began to now develop their own silk industry. And so what we're seeing here is, in this painting by Pollaiuolo, is a representation of the kinds of clothing and innovations that drew on these experiments and changes and innovations, so including this particular removable sleeve. And when we look at the actual motif on the sleeve, we can see something very interesting that is clear if we look at a zoomed out version of these kinds of side portraits. So in this zoomed out version of this type of side portrait, we see a removable sleeve on that is closer to where we're looking, and then on the other side in red is the other sleeve on the model's right arm, and then here in the middle is an overcoat. So if we look at the previous one, there's no overcoat. Here there's a sleeveless overcoat that allows the red removable sleeves to show. And what we see here is something very interesting. These designers, silk designers, began to now assimilate a lot of designs and motifs coming out of the Islamic world. And that was part of the innovation of the fashion industry at the time. And on the sleeve here, one motif we see is a palmette at the top. It's a kind of palm leaf motif, which was popular in the Middle East, North Africa, and all of the silk designs that Europeans imported at in the 13th, 14th century, 15th century. And then likewise on the overcoat, we can see in red a pomegranate motif with leaves and stems in green around it. And that's interesting because pomegranate motifs in the ancient world, and especially in the Middle East and North Africa and the Islamic world, they were symbols of vitality, youth, fertility. And so what we're seeing here, what Pollaiuolo's captured, is a time in Italian silk design and fashion, which really paves the way for modern Italian fashion and the innovations there. We're seeing the assimilation of motifs and designs coming out of the Middle East, North Africa, that the Italians were in a unique position to adopt and innovate on because of that cross-cultural exchange that they had cultivated, for centuries, going back to the 9, 10, 1100s, the Republic of Venice, the Republic of Genoa, here the Duchy of Tuscany, which was formerly in northwest Italy, the Florentine Republic. And so how else can we trace the way that these Middle Eastern and North African designs are being assimilated into the growing local Italian silk industry? Well, in this example, we can see a very famous and powerful royal in the Duchy of Tuscany. This is Leonor di Toledo, or Eleonora di Toledo. So this is the wife of Cosimo di Medici, who was the ruler of the Duchy of Tuscany in the 1500s. And what we see here are some of those very same motifs that were in the previous painting by Pollaiuolo. This is a painting by Bronzino, who was one of many painters who worked under the patronage and support of the ruling Medici family of bankers who also ruled the Duchy of Tuscany in Florence. And here we also see in the middle, in gold, we see that same pomegranate motif, which we saw in the previous image, the pomegranate motif in red. And so here we see it in gold. And what's also interesting is that we likewise see black arabesques all throughout the dress. And then throughout the center of the dress is this medallion. And so it looks quite a bit like Middle Eastern, North African, and Moroccan textiles and carpets for a reason, because Eleonor de Toledo was bringing and assimilating into Italy, as someone who originally was from Toledo, a lot of the designs that the Spaniards had been assimilating into the Spanish silk industry in cities like Barcelona and Granada, which comes out of earlier centuries of exchange with North Africa through Morocco. So this is another very beautiful painting by Bronzino that shows something that the archives tell us, which is that Leonor de Toledo, Eleonora, she was a major figure in really changing the royal and popular culture at the time and inspiring a lot of the new designs that silk designers were experimenting with, including these arabesques and this medallion and the pomegranate motifs. So a very interesting snapshot in time in Florence in the 1500s, the capital of the Republic of Florence and what at this point is now the Duchy of Tuscany, where Italian silk designers are assimilating and experimenting with Middle Eastern and North African motifs and designs as they build out a very profitable, locally made, no longer just imported, silk fashion industry that begins to be exported throughout the rest of Europe. So it's a way for the Italians to keep up with the kinds of profits that are being made by the Spanish and Portuguese and the Dutch as they begin to, on their part, import silk from China, spices from Indonesia, gold and silver from the Americas. And so what's also interesting about this period is how it's not just the silk designers who are experimenting with these types of new designs and fashion, but it's also the painters themselves who are using this opportunity to document these changes and experiment with new painting techniques to capture these scenes in different ways. So on the left, the reason Bronzino's painting evokes in some ways the Mona Lisa of Da Vinci is because both Bronzino, the painter of the painting on the left, the portrait, and Da Vinci used this sfumato technique. It's kind of a smoky technique that does not emphasize borders and lines, and it creates a kind of ethereal, dreamlike representation of the model. In this case, this is what is basically the queen of the Duchy of Tuscany, who was the daughter of a very influential Spanish dignitary in Italy, in Naples, part of a time when the Florentines were intermarrying intentionally with a lot of the elites of neighboring kingdoms like Spain as part of that move towards their global diplomatic trajectory. And so the sfumato technique on the left is different from what the Pollaiuolo brothers use on the right, which is the chiaroscuro technique, which does emphasize lines and has a particular approach to shading and creating a certain type of depth. And that's what gives the painting on the right this hyper-realistic look, almost photographic realism. And I think that's interesting to think about, that the cross-cultural innovation connecting Italy with the Islamic world not only accelerated changes and innovation in silk design and fashion, but also innovation in the actual techniques used by painters of portraits and frescoes at the time. Now, when we turn from Florence to Venice, what we see is something, a parallel story that's part of the same larger narrative of Italy and the Italian kingdoms and republics internally doubling down on their exchange with the Middle East, North Africa, and building new profits, generating new wealth out of their locally produced silks. This is the Venetians were one of the main competitors, kind of collaborators, but also competitors of the Florentines, the Venetian Republic on the other side of Italy's coast, northeast Italy. And the Venetians controlled part of what is now the Balkans, Croatia, cities like Split, which in Italian was Spalato. Italian, a variety of Italian was still spoken around Croatia all the way up until the 18 and 1900s. Dalmatian, which is connected also with Romanian. The Venetians really saw themselves, and here in this fresco in the palace of the Doge in Venice, they really represented themselves as the premier importers of Middle Eastern and North African and Asian silk, and the premier producers of locally made silk. And in this painting, in this fresco, we can see a new generation of painters, people including Bellini, who are also using this chiaroscuro technique for that hyperrealism, but not in the context of a portrait, but in this case, it's a painting of Iranian Safavid dignitaries on the top left in turbans visiting the Doge, who's seated in gold. And on the right in blue, seated to the top right, are Venetian senators. And they are receiving the Safavid dignitaries, and they are also at the lower part of the painting receiving gifts of silk. And you can see how even in that carpet in the center there, that's being presented to these Venetian nobles in black, there are some overlaps with the arabesque seen in the painting of Leonora de Toledo. And what's interesting here is that not only are we seeing this hyper-realistic chiaroscuro technique that was seen in the case of the young Florentine lady by Pollaiuolo, but we're also seeing this interesting use. It's a very large fresco on the ceiling of one of the rooms in the palace. We're seeing this use of a buon fresco technique, which is where the painter uses a kind of wet plaster and then paints the entire fresco very quickly, so that when the plaster dries, a lot of the very bright colors pop out. So again, it's more of that story that we're seeing through these paintings here of not only cross-cultural exchange driving innovation, in this case silk design in Venice, but also innovations in how the painters themselves begin to document a lot of these changes and new motifs. And of course, this is not the first time that the Venetians are experimenting with new ways of representing themselves and their ability and capacity to make Venice, their capital, the center of international exchange with the Middle East, North Africa. This is the Cathedral of St. Mark in the center on the left, and then on the right is the Doge's palace. Of course, the city of Venice sits in a lagoon off the eastern coast of mainland Italy, and in one of the reliefs in one of the doorways of the St. Mark's Cathedral, we see that the Venetians for a few centuries, going back to the 1300s, had already been experimenting with integrating new motifs and images and representations of people from the Middle East and North Africa wearing very colorful designs in silk. And in this case, this is a representation of rulers in Alexandria in Egypt who are shocked that they have now lost their one of their prized possessions, the body of Saint Mark. And on the right side, you can see a little bit of it. These are the people who the Venetians claim to have stole the body of Saint Mark from Alexandria, and brought it to Italy in a way that would now begin to increase the traffic of pilgrims, the movement and arrival of pilgrims from Europe who would eventually visit Jerusalem and cities like Bethlehem, and visit Venice, the city of St. Mark, on their way there rather than go down to the lower part of Italy and travel to Alexandria and Egypt. So in many ways, this was a way of diverting some of that pilgrimage traffic away from Egypt towards, and away from Rome even, towards Venice, and in the pilgrimage route going to the Holy Lands, which at that time were part of the Islamic world. So we're seeing here some of the painters here. So what's interesting here is that this is not even a painting, this is a mosaic. So in earlier centuries, these artists in Venice were beginning to incorporate, you can see that they were experimenting with different ways of representing Middle Eastern, North African silk, like this pink thobe worn by this one of the Egyptian administrators. They're experimenting with new ways to represent these motifs and styles in Italian art. And in this case, this is a mosaic. So if we zoomed in, these would be small tiles. Similar to the mosaics you would see in the city of Ravenna, in the church of San Vitale, where centuries earlier, Italian artists had represented in the mosaics the famous mosaic of Justinian, who back in the 500s from the city of Constantinople, before the Ottoman Empire, when Constantinople was the capital of the Eastern Roman Empire, the Byzantine Empire, the Byzantines controlled part of Italy, and the mosaics at the time captured that. And but what's interesting is that no matter how much the Venetians would experiment with representing themselves as centers of Christianity and sacred history and centers of innovation and silk and design and art, and no matter how much they amplified these styles, even in architecture, these pointed arches that were much more common and typical of the Middle East, North Africa, no matter how much they amplified this kind of visual theater of Venice as a new Alexandria, a center of Middle Eastern, North African silk imports and silk design, they would always have trouble competing with some of the innovations in art and design and international trade and exchange that were happening in Rome and across the Roman Catholic Church. And so if we turn from Venice to Rome here, and the Roman Catholic Church, we see a similar type of innovation in silk design, experiments with new motifs, and then experiments among painters who are capturing all of this. Here's what we see here during the Renaissance in Rome and throughout the Roman Catholic Church. Painters began to experiment with representing Mary, Maria, as basically a contemporary Middle Eastern Christian woman, because of course a lot of the pilgrims were traveling to the Middle East under Ottoman rule and before that Mamluk rule, and they were encountering Middle Eastern Christians in cities like Jerusalem and Bethlehem, and so there was an understanding of the artists that it was worth representing Mary, who's of course from the Middle East, as a contemporary Middle Eastern Christian woman. And we see that in this new technique of painting Mary with wearing veils that specifically have pseudo-Arabic embroidery around the edge of the veil. And so you can see that here, what looks like Arabic embroidery is actually what is intended to look like Arabic embroidery. And this also tells us that Christian pilgrims from Italy and France who are going to the Middle East, we know from archival sources that they actually were bringing back a lot of Middle Eastern Muslim and Christian silk designs. So silk designs and textiles that had Arabic Islamic writing, but also Arabic writing that was coming out of Christian texts and Christian sayings. And so here we can see here the painters are now experimenting with, they're simultaneously documenting the exchange and movement of a lot of this Middle Eastern, North African silk coming in this case into Italy through pilgrims, but the painters are also experimenting with new techniques and ways of representing the Middle East through this pseudo-Arabic style. And we also see here in other examples how the halo around Mary also uses that pseudo-Arabic. And you have to wonder whether coins from the Islamic world that were also part of the kind of souvenirs and treasures that people collected as they came back to Italy, whether the Arabic and calligraphy on Islamic gold coins also inspired the halos that you can see here. So there's the halo with the Pseudo-Arabic, and then these bands on the veil also have this Pseudo-Arabic, and on the right also. So the Roman Catholic Church and painters in Rome are also experimenting with new ways of capturing changes in silk design. And there's also the actual silk designers themselves who we can see here are actually having original imports to work with as they experiment with new motifs and styles. And these are some more examples of that throughout Rome and the Roman Catholic Church. But this wasn't the only way that painters and silk designers were experimenting with new directions in fashion and clothing design. Because interestingly, what made Italy so unique was that not only did it have this international global connection with the Middle East and North Africa and Asia, but it also had this connection with the ancient Greco-Roman world. And here in these paintings, in this particular very famous painting of Mary at the Sistine Chapel, Raphael, we see that Mary's not represented as a contemporary Middle Eastern Christian woman, but she's represented more in the style of ancient Roman figures, including the way that she stands on one foot, on one leg, with her left leg bent slightly. And this is the famous contrapposto pose, which evokes sculptures and statues of Caesar and other ancient figures. And it's supposed to capture the grace and elegance of the human form, particularly among people in positions of sacred or non-sacred leadership. And that's Caesar, similarly standing on one leg with his left leg bent in a kind of graceful pose. And what's interesting is how Italian design and in aesthetics at this time, drawing in part on the ancient world, the ancient Greco-Roman world, and also the contemporary Middle Eastern and North African world, which is also the site of a lot of the ancient world. How a lot of this comes together in works like Michelangelo's La Pieta, where we're seeing now a lot of these silk designs represented in sculpture form. And here, this is a very beautiful sculpture that shows, in some ways, that evokes the painting, the portrait of Eleonora de Toledo, the size of the person being represented. So Mary's figure here is intentionally made to be very large, and it really just brings out, in this case, not royal power, like in the case of Eleonora de Toledo, but in this case, it's the sacred power of the grace of Mary. And so I think bringing all this together, we're seeing a very interesting era here when the Italians in Venice, Florence, Rome, the painters, the designers, they are really building out a very interesting global aesthetic that builds on and is driven by a lot of this cross-cultural exchange linking Italy with the Middle East, North Africa. That also draws on the ancient world, ancient Greco-Roman Europe, Middle East, and North Africa. And it allows the Italians to really generate wealth, both from their fashion designs, their clothing designs, and also generate wealth from these paintings, painters themselves, who are commissioned for a lot of these works that are sometimes part of royal representation in palaces, but then also these are paintings that are bought and sold that themselves become a commodity. And it's a parallel to the way that other Europeans, like in the painting on the left, Dutch painter Vermeer, how the Dutch and the Spanish and the Portuguese, they were generating wealth in new innovations, like in the case of the globe in Vermeer's painting there, generating wealth through the printing of maps and globes, also importing silk in the case of Vermeer's painting there, and eventually in the case of the Dutch, creating new industries like the printing press, printing books of travel, newspapers. So this was the Italian version of generating new wealth through cross-cultural innovation. And so that really wraps up my talk. And again, this comes out of my latest book, Italy and the Islamic World from Caesar to Mussolini. And I'm fascinated by how, one last point here, that there was, in some ways, you might say, from a kind of global geopolitical perspective, geopolitics, there may have been a little bit of a flaw in the shortcomings of Italian innovation, because the Dutch, Spanish, and Portuguese, and later the British at this point, in moving into the 1700s, a lot of their innovations also moved into the world of design, ship design. So the design of boats, the use of cannons that were used by the Ottomans and the Mongols and the Chinese, bringing that onto ships and boats. And you really begin to see very interesting innovations during the Industrial Revolution on the Dutch and the British side, with warships and then also military techniques that, in the case of the French under Napoleon, allowed in the early 1800s, allowed the French to basically invade and take over Italy, which put in process the several decades leading into the rise of a unified modern Italy that began to then amplify its military power. So there was some shortcomings there where the Italians were, yes, they were kind of cutting edge when it came to Venetian galley, those long boats with rows, the Genoese carracks and cogs that were the precursors to the boats used during the Age of Exploration with these very high walls. But a lot of the industries that they made a lot of their money off of, the silk industry, were not part of the portfolio of innovations that the Dutch and the British had expanded into as they became major maritime military powers. But as far as how all this resonates today, of course, the Italians in the Industrial Revolution in the 1900s, they continued to develop this unique sophistication and experimentation with silk design and fashion. And of course, one of the main export industries of the Italians today is their clothing and fashion industry. So thanks again for having me, and I think we'll turn at this point to the Q&A.
Yes, thank you so much for the talk. Yes, as Dr. Akhtar announced, now the Q&A is open, so please write your questions in the Q&A box. I'm going to start with my own questions, if you don't mind, until our audience can take their time to write their questions. I have both methodological
Yes.
questions and questions related to the content.
Great.
So I'm going to start with the methodological,
Yeah.
questions about those approaches. What role did the primary resources, such as merchant records or diplomatic correspondences or even visual representations of these exchanges play in shaping your narrative of Italian exchanges with the Islamic world in this book?
Yeah, that's a great question. So when I worked at the archives of Venice, and then also the Florentine archives, and also the Ottoman archives, I really kept an eye out on some of the ways that the ambassador correspondences and merchant records would talk about the kinds of silks that were being exchanged between the Middle East, North Africa, between Istanbul and Venice and Florence. And then also particular records about the life, the royal records of people like Leonora de Toledo, to understand what was new at the time, what seemed new, what was unusual. And those kinds of archival records gave me kind of a textual counterpart to a lot of the visual record, to get a sense
Mhm.
of at what point were painters now beginning to actually represent the types of objects and the types of designs that the textual record talks about.
Right. So, yeah. So in the case of Eleonora's portraits, and the two portraits, one is with her younger son, and then this portrait that we see on this screen. So the dress, the pomegranate motif at the center, is usually analyzed first of all because of her connections to Spain and the Islamic heritage in Spain. At the same time, her fertility, because it's so central. It is that kind of pomegranate motif. What beyond this kind of analysis can you bring to this narrative?
Yeah, so I think it's interesting that that she was in the textual records, archival records, that she was such a powerful figure in Florence, and she was really involved in multiple sides of innovation in art, even science. So she has these frescoes painted at the palace, the Palazzo Pitti, which is the palace that she has purchased for the Medicis, and has these giant gardens that evoke the Alhambra, which she certainly was familiar with in Granada, associated with the earlier Islamic rule, where in the Islamic context they had these gardens that were a central part of diplomatic reception. She has the Boboli Gardens designed and expanded at the Palazzo Pitti as part of the kind of global diplomatic aesthetic of the Florentines. And so at the Palazzo Pitti, she has these frescoes painted of ancient and biblical and Greco-Roman figures. So ancient figures like Esther, but represented in a Greco-Roman way. And the visual record and the archival record seems to indicate that she wanted to really amplify the role of women in Italian and particularly Florentine, Tuscan politics in a way that maybe draws on the pattern of very powerful women in Spanish and Portuguese rule, playing a central role in their administrations. So she on the one hand, she is a powerful figure that Bronzino represents with this very large dress, kind of like the La Pieta, amplifying and highlighting that kind of stature. And at the same time, yeah, that symbol of fertility in the pomegranate does call to mind the fact that she did have so many children, and did in fact die very young. And so that's something that I find interesting, and I wonder what you think about this question of how powerful a woman was she? Was she aspirationally very powerful? Was she in fact powerful in practice? She's the mother of extremely influential Medici rulers like Ferdinando di Medici, who expands the Livorno port as a kind of low tax, low tariff import-export port, where you have a lot of Jewish and North African, Middle Eastern Muslim, Turkish and Persian traders, British people living there all the way up until until the 1900s under Mussolini, where a lot of that is reversed. And at the same time, she is a very central figure as a kind of full-time mother, taking care of a large number of children, and then on top of it, she dies. And yet, she also understood a lot about health. She was a key figure in introducing a lot of cosmetics and new types of medicinal treatments for facial, for skin care, coming out of Toledo, which was the center of the Arabic to Latin, Greco-Arabic to Latin translation movement. So I wonder what you think about that. Do you think she was this kind of very powerful figure? And does Bronzino's representation of these arabesques and the pomegranate and the medallion, is supposed to bring out her kind of, what the archival texts indicate was her kind of unique fashion sense, or was it supposed to amplify an image of Florence as a place connected with Spain and Morocco? Or and does all of
Right.
this tell us that she was a very powerful kind of influencer, or was she just the wife of Cosimo de' Medici? Because I know you also work on Italian art.
Right. Yes. Yeah. So in my opinion, this is a portrait that amplifies both her role and, and the growing and flourishing silk industry in Florence at the time. I so with the pomegranate motif, it is mostly analyzed that this is a pattern that highlights her role as a mother who produces heir for the Medici rule in Tuscany. At the same time, I always wonder about the arabesque pattern, because in Islamic context, the arabesque means limitless, endless, indefinite continuity of this pattern. So this concept can be in alignment with the desire for the continuity and limitless, indefinite power and rule of the Medici in Tuscany. So they go hand in hand together with this. But even with the arabesque pattern, if we look at it in the earlier periods, like the Umayyad or the Abbasi period, we see that it is pretty much influenced by the vine scrolls in the Roman and Greco-Roman plaster works and even marble works. So I wonder how you analyze the origin. I understand that it might not be possible to now find the origin of this pattern, but since the emergence of Islam in the seventh century and its heavy influence from the Byzantine Empire, Byzantine patterns and Greco-Roman patterns, at the same time Sasanian patterns, this whole arabesque pattern is pretty much a fusion of cultures already as it was developing in the 7th century onward.
Yeah, that's a great question. So I wonder what you think about, in particular, how on the one hand the kind of immediate parallels to some of these designs that she's wearing seem to be places like Granada and Fez, where you see very similar arabesques and pomegranate motifs, and at the same time, like you said, these pomegranate motifs and the arabesques, they're also part of this kind of timeless ancient Greco-Roman and also Persian world of aesthetics and design. And so I think that's a great question. How would you, as an art historian, kind of pinpoint whether these designs are on the part of Bronzino as a painter who's interested in it, or on the part of the actual silk designers who create this dress? To what extent would you say that they are drawing on, maybe very local Moroccan and Spanish designs, and to what extent that are part of and intentionally bringing out this kind of Islamic, Middle Eastern, North African, Arabic, Persian visual aesthetic, and to what extent do you think they are maybe just kind of like as in the case of the Sistine Chapel, to what extent do you think they are just kind of mixing in their own eclectic way contemporary and ancient, global, non-local, international aesthetics?
Yeah, so in my understanding, and I haven't done archival work on this portrait, but I have worked on this, and then it has always been a very interesting portrait.
Yeah.
To me, I definitely think that the arabesque pattern and the pomegranate motif highlights her roots in Spain, and that heritage that was already in the 15th, 16th century part of the visual culture of Spain and where she's coming from. But at the same time, if you look at the collection, the Medici collection in Palazzo Pitti, you see several textile and carpets with very similar designs, like Safavid carpets. They're a pair of greenish background Safavid carpets at Palazzo Pitti with very similar, arabesque and pomegranate, like the Abbasi motif that we know in Persian culture of this motif. So I think the dress has a lot more agency and weight and value in both portraits than than just having one single role of promoting her as a mother or promoting silk industry or promoting the exchanges. I think it combines a lot of historiographical frameworks that are involved in this whole narrative.
And would you say that that's part of a kind of general global or international and kind of timeless, ancient, medieval trajectory on the designer's part? Or
no, I think that's too far.
Yeah,
No,
too
I
far.
think that goes too far. No, I think it's more like a contemporary. This is my opinion, and I'm not
Yeah,
an
yeah.
expert. I
Because
also asked this question from Bruce, who curated the exhibition on the 500 years of anniversary of her birthday. So,
yeah,
so
right.
this I'm always curious about this.
Yeah, because it does, even just looking at it, comparing it even with what the Florentine lady is wearing on the right, it feels like it's something kind of very striking. So I wonder if the
Right.
designer
Yes.
and the painter, at the very least, maybe at the minimum, were saying, let's just capture something very unique and striking. But
Right.
I do
Right.
wonder how, if we were able to kind of interview all of the locals at the time, how exactly they would have seen this. And that's where
Right.
I think
Yes.
sometimes it gets tough with the archives to figure out how exactly, did they see this particular dress? Is it like,
From
wow,
the contemporary point of view.
yeah,
Right.
like what a cool Spanish
Yes.
dress, or what a cool Florentine dress, or something like that.
Yes, so we do have a question in the Q&A.
Yeah.
Sorry. Thank you, Dr. Akhtar, for this wonderful, informative lecture. Did I understand correctly that the Italians were able to import silk and spices cheaper than the Islamic countries? I wonder why.
Yes, so I meant to indicate that the Italians were able to import those silk and spices cheaper than other Europeans because they had direct access to the middlemen, so to speak, of Middle Eastern and North African traders in cities like Aleppo, Haleb in Syria, Istanbul, Constantinople, Alexandria. And so that allowed them to have access to local Middle Eastern and North African producers of silk and silk pigment, but then also Middle Eastern and North African importers of spices from Indonesia. And the Italians could then buy that at a lower price than other Europeans who might not have those direct connections with the Middle Eastern and North African merchants, and so then the Italians could then maybe buy them more expensive, spend more at a higher price than what the Middle Eastern North African importers were importing it for. But then the Italians could then kind of increase that price as they sold them to other Europeans.
Thank you. So my next question is about there's another question about your methodology. So, how does your book's methodological approach to this long-term continuity from ancient Rome to the 20th century challenge the current historiographical frameworks in Mediterranean studies?
Yeah, I think a lot of there's a few ways I think. One is that I think we think of these countries like Egypt and Italy and Tunisia. I think we tend to look at their histories from the rise of the nationalist republic eras. In the case of the Arab Republic of Egypt in the 1950s, the Italian Republic, and we often think of a lot of modern exchanges between Egypt and Italy today under Meloni. I think we think of these countries as, you know, uh, moving towards a kind of new global era where the Middle East and North Africa and Europe is now cultivating new exchange and renewable energy. Um, and what I'm really interested in showing is how a lot of this exchange is actually a revival or a return to, earlier centuries when the Middle East, North Africa, and Europe were deeply in conversation and in terms of trade and aesthetics. And in some ways, the era of Mussolini and the Arab Republic of Egypt in the 1900s, modern Tunisia. In many ways, that was in some ways a kind of break from earlier centuries of close exchange. So in the 1900s, you have a lot of these people in Livorno who speak the modern variety of Italian, which is Tuscan, Florentine Italian, who are Roman Catholic and Greek Orthodox and Jewish, and a lot of them are living between Livorno and Tunisia, Livorno, and other parts of Italy and Egypt. Singers like Yolanda Gigliotti, who's Dalida, who grew up in Egypt, and her parents who moved from Italy to Egypt lived there in the early 1900s as part of the music industry, film industry, and so a lot of that ancient exchange going all the way back to the Ottoman Empire, and then the Eastern Roman Empire in the 1300s, the Islamic empires, all the way back to Caesar. these are really centuries of close connections in terms of trade, innovation, aesthetics, design. Tunisia, Sicily, Egypt, and Venice. That I think in many ways are they kind of are they are eclipsed by a lot of the establishment of the new boundaries and borders of these post-empire republics and kingdoms in the 1900s. And I think now we're seeing a kind of return to that exchange. And one thing I'll add there is that in the case of Italy in particular, sometimes it becomes hard to talk about it as a single story because my book breaks it down in by city. So there's Venice, Genoa, Florence. Sometimes it's hard to talk about it as a single story because we often don't like to talk about Italy before the 1900s, before the unification of the different republics. But in fact, the archival sources tell us that in fact the Italians were seen as the Italians when they were traveling abroad in Egypt, because it was understood that whether the Italians were from Venice or Genoa, when they were working in Alexandria or Syria, they were bringing a kind of Italian aesthetic, Italian import practices, and there was some shared culture across the Italian republics and kingdoms, which we know to have been true in the 1600s in Rome, because Rome, as the center of the papal state, the head center of the Roman Catholic Church, that was where a lot of the Italians, republics built, and the duchies built a lot of their estates. They conducted a lot of their diplomacy. Pope Leo X was a Medici from Florence, and in the 1500s, Ferdinando di Medici, who's the son of Leonora here, of course, built a diplomatic estate in Rome. And this is where you have this competition between, centuries ago, Florentine Italian and Venetian Italian as the kind of prestige dialects. And Florentine dialect wins, and the older Rome local dialect of Romanesco gets kind of Florentinized today. So I think there's a longer continuous story that is sometimes missed by very strict understandings of country names and cultures and whatnot.
Thank you. So my next question is about the political strategies and responses to the growing maritime expansion of the Portuguese and the Dutch in the Mediterranean, and also in their trade with the Middle East, with Persia, with India, even with the Ottoman Empire. How did those strategies by the Italians influence the artistic productions in the Renaissance?
Yeah, so can you repeat the last part? So how did the exchange on the part of the Portuguese, the age of exploration?
How did the Italian responses to this growing maritime influence the artistic productions in the Renaissance?
Yeah, well, I think that is the question, how did the Italian responses kind of shape changes in Italy or in the other parts of Europe?
In Italy.
Oh, in Italy. Yeah, I think it's an interesting question. It seems to me that that in many ways the Italians now, where they had this close connection with other parts of Europe, like they had, of course, they had the hotel campus type of place where not only Ottoman Empire merchants and Safavid merchants would stay in Venice, and then they would go to their campus hotel at night, the Fondaco dei Turchi, but there was also the German Fondaco of the Alemanni. And so it seems to me that what really changes in Italy is a lot of the methods and technologies associated with this production. So I think the way that the Italians move into the Industrial Revolution and begin to now integrate a lot of these steam-powered machines, I think it really allows them to kind of scale in a large way a lot of their innovations that they were previously maybe able to produce at a smaller scale. So I feel like from a technology perspective and a kind of production perspective, one major impact is the scale of a lot of their innovation. And then, of course, there's the French side associated with Napoleon. So I think as you get into northern Italy, you begin to see more of this impact of French and German styles of clothing. and this, after the conquest of Napoleon in the late 1700s, a pretty strong turn away from a lot of that, a lot of these kind of Mediterranean designs and styles, and absorption of German and French royal aesthetics. But then in all cases, as Italy moves through the Industrial Revolution, there's this continued interest in innovation design, clothing that they're able to scale with a lot of the new machines that they're able to import and produce. But I don't know. I wonder
Right.
if I wonder if you have thoughts on that. Sort of how Italy changes with the Industrial Revolution, and
Well,
maybe
what with the Industrial Revolution,
sorry, with the Age of
or the second
Exploration
with
and this kind of global maritime exchange. Of course, a lot of new Asian things coming in. What would you
of
say?
course. Yes, so I mean, in to my knowledge, I mean, because of the shifting alliances in the East, especially with the Persians and the Ottomans, and then with the Mughals being more in alliance with the Persians, I think the material culture of the Renaissance in Italy changed over time, especially with some strategies that they wanted to circumvent the routes that crossed Ottoman routes. So they wanted to go from other parts. They wanted to go either from the Caspian Sea or for the Sea of Oman and the Persian Gulf, connecting to the Mediterranean and to Europe. So I think they went more with portable and smaller objects, and then the circulation of those portable objects and the patterns had an influence on and shaping the decorative patterns in Renaissance art. But other than that, it is not in the grand scale that it was previously, with the Ottomans being the dominant power in the Islamic world, in contact with the Italian centers.
And would you say that French Indochine, French Vietnam, and the British in India, would you say that some of that is also coming in through the French or through the British in maybe northern Italy in Livorno? Because I know Livorno was also hosting a lot of British merchants, cotton merchants and whatnot. Would you say that in the objects that you've studied, the portable objects, is there any of that kind of British India or French
Yeah,
Vietnam?
British India. Yes, that was a growing that became more and more important, especially as the British and the Dutch, first the Dutch and then the British, they came to like Western Indian ports, and that became like an established route for them to trade. At the same time, circumventing the Ottoman territories. So with the Ottomans, spice and carpets and metalware with Indian market, it was more about like smaller portable objects like mother of pearl, turquoise, these kinds of materials. So I think it had a more visible impact on the material culture of the Renaissance rather than
And would you say that
other
maybe, would you say that
aspects.
places like Tuscany, because of the city of Livorno hosting a lot of British merchants, would you say that maybe that connection with British India, is that maybe where a lot of changes in jewelry happen in Italy? Maybe with the import of a lot of Asian jewelry or precious.
That cannot be the only. I don't think that can be the only resource for that influence. But I think
Yeah.
over time, we do see more influence of that, but that cannot be the only resource.
Yeah. Because I wonder if there's a particular, like even in the Florentine lady here on the right with the pearls that she's wearing or the precious stones around her neck, I wonder if there's a particular kind of piece of jewelry or a particular kind of interior design, like chairs, like in the case of Vermeer, they used to have a lot of these silk chairs. I wonder if you would find, I wonder if you found that in your research in Italy, was there a particular kind of object that was really quintessentially Asian or British India or French Vietnam, uh, that
I know of mother of pearl.
mother of pearl? Yeah.
Yeah, mother of pearl and lapis lazuli.
Oh,
These were
lapis
the two
lazuli.
materials that,
Interesting.
as far as I know, my knowledge of it is very limited, but these are the two substances that I know
Interesting.
of that had a growing, interest
And of course,
in.
the porcelain story is so confusing because the Italians were early collectors of Chinese porcelain, but then they're also trading with the Safavids and the Ottomans, who are not only creating their own
Right.
varieties of pseudo porcelain, but then the Safavids and the Ottomans also have their own collections of original porcelain. So I
Of
wonder if
course,
that,
especially with the Ottomans and with the Iznik pottery.
Yeah, so I wonder if the Italians also, from that age of exploration influence, I wonder if they were getting some kind of new variety of ceramics.
Of course, I know of both Safavid and Ottoman ceramics were objects of interest for collectors, Italian collectors in the early modern period.
And does that change the entire landscape of interior design in kitchens and households in Italy
Not
the
the
way it does?
entire. No, I don't know. To my knowledge, again, I don't think that can it was like the most influential,
Yeah,
object to circulate, but it was definitely an object. It's a sort the category of object that was that created a lot of interest in among collectors in the early modern period.
interesting. So I guess Italy, I
Yes.
guess doesn't Italy remains kind of a little bit of a local player, going into the 18,
Right.
1900s.
Right. Yes, yes. And this conversation can go on and on and on, but
Yes.
unfortunately, we're running out of time. And so I would like to thank you again for joining us today and sharing your recent book with us. Thank you so much. We definitely enjoyed it. And I would like to remind our audience that next year we're going back to normal time because I believe daylight saving is happening this weekend in Europe. So we will be back at 11 p.m. Florentine time next week. I will make an announcement for that on top of the invitation email for next week, but I just wanted to announce it now. Thank you so much again for joining us. Please join us again next week. Yes.
Yeah, thank you for having me. And I'm on LinkedIn at Ali H Akhtar, and you have my email address ali.akhtar
Yes.
at nyu.edu. So I'm happy to take questions. And thank you again for having me. And thanks for a great conversation. I enjoyed this
Of
conversation
course,
about
yes, me
Italian
too.
history.
Thank you so much. I hope everybody else could enjoy today's talk, and I hope that you come back to Map Forum next week for same time, same link. Thank you so much,
Thank you very
everybody.
much.
Have
Thank
a
you
good
again.
night. Bye bye.
Good
Bye
night.
bye. Bye.